Welcome back to Organizational Conflict, Organizational NCRP. Last week, I spent some time reviewing the classical ombuds position. This week, I had promised you I will say more about the organizational ombuds. But first, I want to say that in the next few weeks, I want to start to explore with you the complexity of this work from my real-world experience. And there is no way in a brief course that we can do all the possible things that I would recommend for preparing yourself to do the best of organizational NCRP. You really need to be prepared after being introduced to all the various skills and theories that we have taught you in this program, to apply them with reflective practice and slowly but surely develop them and become masterful with these skills, with this knowledge, with all the tools we give you. Every organization is its own world, its own complex system. And just like when I teach family and marital mediation, learning to work within complex systems takes time. And I will be able to introduce some of the things that have helped me over the years with various organizations. But as I've mentioned earlier, you really need to be prepared to do your own analysis of an organization, your own internal assessment, program evaluation, research, what you're learning in conflict resolution systems design, and to prioritize what needs to happen first, because there are so many possibilities in different organizations. And this complexity is exactly what the organizational ombuds faces on a daily basis. And so generally the most successful I have known have made a lifetime career of serving their particular organizations. Let me turn now to the PowerPoint that I have prepared to help you further understand the organizational ombuds. I see this as another great NCRP career path, particularly for those of you who have a background in counseling or other helping professions, who have been practicing the skills of NCRP in other capacities, because truly this is a career path that requires seasoned senior professionals. It's rare that an organizational ombuds at a major corporation, international agency, university, college, does not have a long, successful resume as a counselor, psychologist, social worker. Some actually have PhDs because they're doing high-level research. For example, an organizational ombuds I knew in the World Health Organization. And the UN organizational ombuds I know have been hired by the UN after impressing people with their savvy as organizational ombuds elsewhere. Now, the only exception to this is some university and colleges, UCLA, for example, some of the bigger universities and colleges will hire junior, relatively new NCRP professionals, and then those junior staff will work their way up over time. Now, they certainly are the place, the confidential and hopefully trusted place, that members of that organization, employees, clients, students, if it's a school, even community members will approach with whatever problem they're having. Now, sadly, there are some systems around the world where the organizational ombuds is more of an organizational puppet and cannot be trusted and is not trusted by organizational stakeholders. Hopefully with your NCRP education, you would know how to rectify this. Must be prepared. I mean, depending on the agency where you would be working, the corporation, the hospital, the university, to counsel people who are quite emotional, maybe feeling suicidal, despairing, very angry. The organizational ombuds normally acts as at least one of that organization's mediators. So if you're not somebody who's comfortable with facilitative, highly emotional mediation, you probably wouldn't want to consider this role. Now, the International Ombuds Association formed. I told you some of the history and how they've hired me, asked me to work with them doing research several years ago. I think they formed about 12 or 15 years ago because too much of the world was confusing the various ombuds roles. They didn't understand the difference between organizational and classical, between what happens in the United States and what happens in Canada and Europe. They really started to come together as a group. And their main focus, besides publicizing their role and supporting their members, was to come together on ethical boundaries. I recommended to you before that you become a student member if you have any interest in this career path, and I recommend it again. Usually a student membership is much more affordable. It's an incredibly rich networking opportunity. Now, organizational ombuds, unlike classical, they are not impartial, independent investigators who publish findings and recommendations. Instead, they are the organization's internal, normally full-time conflict resolution professionals. Now, occasionally you find part-time organizational ombuds who have other organizational roles, and that combo actually represents severe ethical challenges and dilemmas, and oftentimes IOA would tell you it's inappropriate. For example, for a faculty, a professor at a university or college, to also serve as the student or the faculty ombuds. There are conflicts of interest there. We don't have time to introduce you to all these different codes of ethics. We start to introduce the various NCRP codes of ethics in our ethics course. You will need, depending on your career path, to get engaged with the professional association that can help you further understand these professional ethical parameters. And in my opinion, you need to stay involved in those discussions over your career because challenges will inevitably arise. Instead, as I introduced a few minutes ago, they are the confidential, that is part of their code of ethics. They share that with mediators. The confidential organizational ear for unhappy people. And normally those are employees, but in a university, college setting, that includes students ombuds. And depending on the complexity of the organization, there might be a variety of ombuds serving various groups. They will be the shuttle diplomacy like mediator going back and forth between organizational constituencies and the leadership. They must respect confidentiality. Are they able to do it in a savvy, appropriate way? That varies person to person. That's why I'm recommending that you devote yourself to studying these ethics with other like professionals, because it's tricky. How do you advise organizational leadership without disclosing the identity of the people who have come to you with their concerns? That takes some reflection, some consultation. And then the other issue, which I raised a little earlier, is that oftentimes because the organization employs them and pays them very well, this is one of our lucrative career paths, there is a strong argument that some organizational ombuds are more like organizational puppets. They are more like, they shouldn't be like human resources. And on the leadership side, they should not be taking sides. But, you know, this varies, and I would say in many organizations, this role, if it's not working or helping the organization, the likely explanation is that they're not trusted to be confidential and to be impartial. They must be in order to be their most effective, no question. But if you would ask yourself, would you trust someone employed by your organization who depends on the leadership's favor to keep their job, to keep getting, you know, annual pay increases, maybe promotions? Many times we would say no. We would not trust them to be impartial. And so the challenge, the practice of the organizational ombuds who are seriously committed to their code of ethics and to being truly independent and impartial is how to walk that middle ground without offending leadership and being able to keep their jobs. And it's, you can imagine, challenge by challenge, case by case. It's not easy. It's a little bit like being a mediator. Oftentimes people want you to be on their side. And if you're not on their side, they don't trust that you're not on the other side. They really don't have any history or experience with truly impartial, independent people walking down the middle, treating everybody equally. Now, some of the ethics you study if you decide to join IOA is that you are not the legal department. Most of you aren't qualified to give out any legal advice anyways, but even if you were, you wouldn't be able to give out legal advice, just like ethically, mediators aren't able to give out legal advice. And hopefully you are skilled in NCRP. You're not human resources. Much of the ethical discussion is around the distinctions between this role and these two roles. You may be advising management to mediate or otherwise take action to avoid a lawsuit. There's nothing wrong with that. But you may be surveying organizational stakeholders in order to assess the climate, figure out what is needed to transform the climate. But what matters most if you are an IOA member is that you do all of this in accord with the IOA Code of Ethics. Transforming high conflict culture takes years. I have worked with many against all odds. Actually, my Holding These Truths workbook it contains several real-world case studies of against all odds conflict and needing to diffuse a potential going postal situation, needing to confront fraud and deceit. You know, I've had to work with people who have been laid off when there have been mergers and downsizing. And this is why I'm telling you, I'm only going to be able to give you a few tips, a few guidelines based on my real world experience. But I will tell you, if you do know any high conflict culture, and I would say most of the organizations in the United States and the world today are dysfunctional high conflict cultures. They might be hiding that conflict, behind publicity campaigns, behind advertising. But most organizations, they said in the 80s when there was a lot of downsizing of government agencies under President Clinton, that Americans were now turning to their workplace organizations as families, as pseudo-families, substitute families. And just like families are dysfunctional and have layers and levels of conflict, so do organizations. Why I'm giving you this PowerPoint, let me explain. I'm asking, do you know any organizational ONSPUDs? And I'm also going to ask, do you know any classical ONSPUDs or some of the other types of ONSPUDs? Please don't confuse them. Like I mentioned with the UN, some organizations have both. And it is very important, if you are trusting or working with an ONSPUD, that you first figure out which role they're playing. Otherwise, it can really rise up, hit you in the face. You also must educate your organizational constituency about the various roles and the distinctions between the roles. Now, this is what I mentioned earlier in an earlier lecture. The United Nations has volunteer classical ONSPUDs who investigate human rights abuses around the world. I highly recommend that you consider doing this as an internship or post-graduation if you are interested in this role. Very important service, wonderful opportunity. But the UN also has professional organizational ONSPUDs who are serving the management staff within with their conflict resolution skills, whether that's mediation, organizational research like you're doing in this course. And these are quite distinct positions. Now, I must say, despite my research with the OOs, as organizational ONSPUDs call themselves in the IOA, I have still known OOs who have left their international agencies because the corruption and the power abuse is so challenging to confront within. So despite best efforts, they haven't been able to clean it up, and that's very sad to hear. Okay, I think I have introduced enough of the organizational ONSPUDs for you to have a better picture of this particular role. Starting next week, I'm going to be talking about organizational change, organizational transformation on an applied case-by-case basis. Have a wonderful week. As always, you can email me with your questions. And if you need my support with connecting with professional organizations, you only need to ask. See you soon. Take care.